7,600 churches. That's not a typo. That's not an exaggeration. In the past 2 years, the United Methodist Church has lost 7,600 congregations. 1/4 of all United Methodist churches in America have left the denomination. This is the largest church split in modern history, bigger than the Presbyterian schism, bigger than the Baptist division, bigger than anything we've seen in contemporary Christianity. And it happened so quietly that most Americans didn't even notice. A pastor in Georgia told me about the Sunday morning when everything changed. He'd been at his Methodist church for 18 years, baptized children, married couples, buried members he loved. The church was his family. That Sunday, he stood before his congregation and said, "We're leaving the United Methodist Church. We voted to disaffiliate. Next week, we'll no longer be Methodist." He expected relief. Instead, he watched his church fracture in real time. A woman who'd been a member for 40 years stood up and walked out, saying, "This isn't what John Wesley would have wanted." 3 families followed her. By the end of the month, the church had lost 30% of its members. Multiply that scene by 7,600 churches. Millions of Methodists forced to choose sides. Families divided. Congregations torn apart. A denomination that survived the Civil War couldn't survive the culture war. Today, we're investigating the largest split in modern church history. What caused it? Why it happened now? What both sides believe they're fighting for? And what this reveals about the future of American Christianity. If you want to understand one of the most consequential moments in religious history, subscribe now. Because what happened to the Methodists is happening across American Christianity. And your church might be next. To understand why 7,600 churches left, you need to understand what they were fighting about. The issue wasn't theology in the traditional sense. Both sides believe in the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, salvation by grace. The issue was sexuality. Specifically, whether the church should ordain LGBTQ clergy and perform same-sex marriages. This debate has been raging in the United Methodist Church for over 50 years, but it reached a breaking point in the past decade. The United Methodist Church has a global structure. It's not just American, it's a worldwide denomination with strong churches in Africa, the Philippines, and other countries. This matters because it meant the debate wasn't just American progressives versus American conservatives. It was Western progressive theology versus Global South conservative theology. In 2019, the General Conference, the Methodist governing body, met to decide the issue once and for all. Delegates from around the world gathered to vote. Progressive Methodists proposed the One Church Plan, which would allow individual churches and regional conferences to decide their own policies on LGBTQ inclusion. It was designed to keep the church together by letting everyone follow their conscience. Conservative Methodists, supported strongly by African delegates, proposed the traditional plan, which reaffirmed the existing ban on ordaining LGBTQ clergy and performing same-sex marriages. The vote wasn't close. The traditional plan passed 53% to 47%. Conservative theology won. Progressive Methodists were devastated. Many had assumed the church would move toward inclusion. Instead, the restrictions were reinforced. Here's where it gets complicated. Even though conservatives won the vote, they started leaving the denomination. Why would the winning side leave? Because they didn't trust what would happen next. They knew that many progressive bishops and regional conferences would simply ignore the rules, that progressive churches would ordain LGBTQ clergy anyway, that the denomination would functionally become affirming even if the official rules said otherwise. And they were right. Several progressive bishops announced they wouldn't enforce the traditional plan. Progressive churches began performing same-sex marriages despite the ban. The rules on paper didn't match reality on the ground. Conservative Methodists realized that even though they'd won the vote, they'd lost the denomination. The institutional church was moving toward affirmation no matter what the official policy said. So they did something unprecedented. They negotiated an exit. In 2020, Methodist leaders on both sides agreed to what was called the Protocol of Reconciliation and Grace through Separation. It was essentially an amicable divorce. Churches could leave the denomination, keep their property, and start new denominations without years of legal battles. Then COVID hit. The General Conference that was supposed to ratify the protocol was postponed. First to 2021, then 2022, then 2024. The official separation agreement was never finalized. But conservative churches didn't wait. Using existing disaffiliation provisions in Methodist law, they began leaving anyway. First hundreds, then thousands, then 7,600. Subscribe now if you're starting to see why this matters, because we need to understand what each side believes they're fighting for. Let me present the conservative Methodist position as fairly as I can. Because if we're going to understand this split, we need to understand what motivated thousands of churches to leave a denomination they loved. Conservative Methodists believe that Scripture clearly teaches that sexual intimacy is designed by God for marriage between one man and one woman. They point to Genesis, to Jesus' affirmation of marriage, to Paul's teachings in Romans and 1 Corinthians. They don't see this as cultural prejudice or outdated tradition. They see it as God's design for human sexuality revealed in Scripture. One conservative pastor told me, "I don't hate LGBTQ people. I want to welcome them, love them, and share the gospel with them. But I can't affirm behavior that Scripture calls sinful. That's not compassion, that's compromise." Conservative Methodists watched as other mainline denominations, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, moved toward full LGBTQ affirmation. And they watched those denominations lose members dramatically. They saw theological liberalization leading to institutional decline. They believed the United Methodist Church was heading down the same path. That once the church affirmed same-sex relationships, it would be a slippery slope to abandoning other biblical teachings. But it wasn't just about theology. It was about trust. Conservative Methodists felt betrayed by denominational leadership. They'd won the vote in 2019. The traditional plan was official Methodist policy. But progressive bishops refused to enforce it. Progressive churches violated it with no consequences. One conservative Methodist leader said, "We played by the rules. We won the vote, and then we watched our bishops ignore the vote and do whatever they wanted. At that point, we realized there was no point staying in a denomination where the rules don't matter." There was also a strong element of cultural analysis. Conservative Methodists believed that Western progressive Christianity had been captured by secular culture. That instead of the church transforming culture, culture was transforming the church. They pointed to progressive Methodist churches that looked more like social justice organizations than churches, where sermons were about political activism more than the gospel, where the Bible was treated as culturally conditioned rather than authoritative. They decided to leave rather than compromise what they believed was biblical truth. Here's what's crucial to understand. These weren't fringe churches. These were mainstream Methodist churches. Many were large, healthy, growing congregations. They didn't leave because they were dying. They left because they believed staying would require them to compromise their convictions. Now let me present the progressive Methodist position with equal fairness, because they believe just as strongly that they're being faithful to Jesus and Scripture. Progressive Methodists believe that the church has been on the wrong side of history on LGBTQ inclusion, just as it was initially on the wrong side of slavery and women's rights. They believe Scripture needs to be interpreted through historical context and through the lens of Jesus' overarching message of love and inclusion. They point to the fact that Jesus never mentioned homosexuality, that the handful of biblical passages addressing it are either culturally specific or mistranslated, that committed same-sex relationships as we understand them today didn't exist in the biblical world. One progressive pastor told me, "I have LGBTQ members in my congregation who love Jesus, serve faithfully, and demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit. How can I tell them God rejects their relationships? That contradicts everything I see Jesus doing in the Gospels." Progressive Methodists watched LGBTQ youth in their communities attempt suicide at rates far higher than their peers. They saw families torn apart when kids came out. They heard stories of LGBTQ people being rejected by churches in cruel and devastating ways. They decided that full inclusion wasn't compromise, it was compassion. That welcoming LGBTQ people fully into the life of the church, including ordination and marriage, was the loving thing to do. They also made biblical arguments. They pointed out that the church has changed its interpretation on many issues, that we no longer support slavery even though the Bible never explicitly condemns it, that we ordain women even though some biblical passages seem to forbid it, that we've reinterpreted Scripture before and we can do it again. One progressive Methodist theologian said, "Every generation of Christians has had to decide how to apply ancient texts to new contexts. We're doing what the church has always done, asking what faithfulness looks like in our time." Progressive Methodists felt frustrated that conservative churches, especially in Africa, had so much power in a denomination that started in England and grew in America. They saw the traditional plan passing primarily because of African votes and felt that was unfair. They also believed that conservative Methodists were using LGBTQ issues as a wedge to leave for political reasons. That it wasn't really about theology, it was about conservative Methodists wanting a more politically conservative denomination. Here's what progressive Methodists didn't expect: that conservatives would actually leave. They thought conservatives would eventually accept the progressive direction of the church, that resistance would fade, that the denomination would slowly move toward full inclusion and everyone would adjust. Instead, they watched 7,600 churches walk out the door, and many of those churches took significant financial resources with them. Behind the statistics and theology are real people experiencing real pain. Let me share their stories. Pastor Michael's story: forced to choose. Pastor Michael had served his Methodist church in North Carolina for 12 years. He's theologically conservative but has gay friends he loves. He didn't want the church to split. When his congregation voted to disaffiliate, 43% voted to stay Methodist. Those 43% left the church. Some were families he'd known for over a decade. He told me, "I baptized their children. I officiated their parents' funerals. And now they won't speak to me because of a denominational decision. The institution survived, but the relationships didn't." Sarah's story: LGBTQ and Methodist. Sarah is a lesbian who grew up Methodist. She came out in college and expected rejection. Instead, her progressive Methodist church welcomed her fully. She found a spiritual home. When her church decided to stay in the denomination while most surrounding churches left, she felt both relief and grief. Relief that her church stayed. Grief that so many churches publicly declared that people like her weren't welcome. She told me, "I know theologically conservative people believe they're being faithful. But when 7,600 churches leave specifically to avoid affirming people like me, it's hard not to take it personally. It feels like rejection on a massive scale." Bishop Karen's story: losing half a conference. Bishop Karen oversees a Methodist regional conference in the South. In her area, over 60% of churches voted to leave. She's watched her conference hemorrhage members money and influence. She told me, "I'm trying to lead a denomination that's collapsing around me. We're closing ministerial programs, cutting staff, consolidating offices, and I'm supposed to cast vision for the future when we just lost most of our churches." The family's divided. Multiple people told me about families torn apart by the split. A father who was a Methodist pastor voted for his church to leave. His daughter is lesbian and stopped speaking to him. They haven't reconciled. A couple married 50 years attends different churches now. He went with the disaffiliating church. She stayed Methodist. They don't talk about it. A youth group that had been together for years split when their church disaffiliated. Teenagers who'd been best friends stopped texting. The youth pastor said it was the most painful thing he'd ever watched. The small towns. In small towns where the Methodist church was the community center, the splits have been devastating. One town in Tennessee had one Methodist church. When it disaffiliated, the members who wanted to stay Methodist had to drive 30 minutes to another town. The community lost its gathering place. Weddings that would have happened there didn't. Funerals were held elsewhere. The social fabric of the town was damaged. This is the human cost of the split, not just institutional division, but relationships severed, communities fractured, and people wounded. The Methodist split isn't just a Methodist story. It's a preview of what's coming for American Christianity. Let me identify what this reveals. Revelation 1. The center cannot hold. The Methodist Church tried to be a big tent, progressive and conservative, traditional and affirming. For decades, they held together despite deep disagreements. That's over. The center collapsed. Churches sorted themselves into camps. There's no middle ground on the issues that divide them. This is happening across American Christianity. Denominations that tried to hold both progressive and conservative wings are fracturing. The Presbyterian Church, the Baptist conventions, the Anglicans, everyone is sorting. Revelation 2. Global Christianity is conservative. One of the most significant aspects of the Methodist split is that African Methodists were strongly conservative. The traditional plan passed largely because of African votes. This reveals a fundamental reality. Christianity is growing in the Global South and declining in the West, and Global South Christianity is theologically conservative. Western progressives assumed the future of Christianity was progressive. They were wrong. The future of Christianity is African, Asian, and Latin American, and it's conservative. Revelation 3. Property matters more than unity. The Methodist split was relatively amicable compared to other denominational fights because there was a clear process for leaving and keeping property. In other denominations, legal battles over church buildings have lasted years and cost millions. Churches that want to leave are told they'll lose their buildings if they go. This reveals how much institutional Christianity cares about property and money versus unity and mission. Revelation 4. Politics drives theology. Let's be honest. The Methodist split is as much about politics as theology. Progressive Methodists tend to vote Democrat. Conservative Methodists tend to vote Republican. The theological debates about sexuality track almost perfectly with political divisions. This isn't coincidence. American Christianity has been so captured by partisan politics that theological positions have become markers of political identity. Revelation 5. Young people are leaving. Here's what both sides need to hear. While conservative and progressive Methodists were fighting about who gets to be Methodist, young people were leaving Methodism entirely. They watched the adults they respected engage in years of bitter conflict. They saw the church prioritize institutional concerns over mission. They concluded that Christianity is more about defending positions than following Jesus. The real winner of the Methodist split? None. The real winner is secular culture, because both sides lost credibility and drove young people away. Subscribe now if this is opening your eyes to what's really happening, because we need to talk about what comes next. So what happens to the United Methodist Church now? And what happens to the 7,600 churches that left? Let me offer some predictions. For the United Methodist Church, the denomination will likely continue moving toward full LGBTQ inclusion. Without conservative churches holding them back, progressive leadership will move quickly. By 2025 or 2026, expect the UMC to officially change its book of discipline to allow LGBTQ ordination and same-sex marriage. This will be celebrated by remaining progressives. But the denomination will be much smaller. They've lost 1/4 of their churches and an even larger percentage of their members, since many disaffiliating churches were larger than average. Financially, the UMC is in crisis. Those departing churches took their tithes with them. Denominational programs are being cut. Seminary enrollment is declining. The institutional infrastructure that took 2 centuries to build is collapsing. The UMC will survive, but as a much smaller, more progressive, and more culturally liberal denomination. Think Episcopal Church, not evangelical powerhouse. For the disaffiliated churches, most of the churches that left have joined or are forming the Global Methodist Church, a new conservative denomination that explicitly affirms traditional sexual ethics. The global Methodist Church is growing rapidly. It's already one of the largest Methodist denominations in America despite being only a few years old. But they face challenges too. They're starting from scratch on denominational infrastructure. They don't have the established seminaries, pension systems, or institutional support the UMC had. Many younger pastors don't want to join any denomination. They've seen how denominations can become more about institutional preservation than mission. They're staying independent. For other denominations, every mainline Protestant denomination is watching nervously. The Presbyterian Church USA is losing churches. The Evangelical Lutheran Church faces similar tensions. The Episcopal Church already split years ago. The Methodist split is a template. It shows that you can divide relatively peacefully if there's a process for property transfer. Other denominations are creating similar exit pathways. Expect more splits, more denominations fracturing along progressive conservative lines, more churches becoming independent. For American Christianity, the age of big tent denominations is ending. We're entering an era of sordid Christianity. Progressive churches in one camp, conservative churches in another, very little in between. This sorting might actually be healthy in some ways. Creates clarity. People know what they're getting when they visit a church. But it also means Christians will rarely encounter believers who think differently. Echo chambers will intensify. Tribalism will deepen. The question we should ask. Here's what bothers me about the entire Methodist split. For all the talk about faithfulness and conscience and biblical truth on both sides, I rarely heard anyone ask, what does this fight reveal to the watching world about Jesus? When non-Christians watched Methodists spend years in bitter conflict, watched 7,600 churches leave, watched families and communities fractured, what did they learn about Christianity? They learned that Christians can't love across differences, that we'll sacrifice relationships for institutional positions, that unity is less important than being right. Jesus said, "They'll know you are my disciples by your love for one another." The Methodist split showed that we're not very good at that love. Both sides believe they're defending truth. Both think they're being faithful. But neither side can claim they prioritized unity. And that should convict all of us. If this investigation challenged you, moved you, or gave you clarity, subscribe now. Share this with someone who needs to understand what happened to the Methodists and what it means for all of us. And remember, denominations come and go. Institutions rise and fall. But the Church of Jesus Christ, the body of believers united by faith in Him, transcends all our divisions. The question is whether we'll act like it. Until next time, may we love across differences, may we prioritize unity without sacrificing truth, and may we remember that we're all broken people following the same Jesus. That's the gospel. Everything else is just religion trying to organize it.